welcome everyone. We are so pleased you're joining our conversation today on the mind-body connection. So thanks for tuning in. Over the next 45 minutes, we'll be talking about what the cutting-edge research is telling us about the mind-body connection and the relationship of this connection to health and well-being. We're going to dispel some common myths and share tips for well-being that are backed by science. And we're going to answer some of the questions that you sent in over the past couple of weeks. My name is Charles Raison. I am a professor in the School of Human Ecology at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm a faculty member at the Center for Healthy Minds.
And I'm Melissa Rosenkranz. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry here at UW, and I'm also faculty at the Center for Healthy Minds.
Absolutely. Okay, so Melissa, why don't we get started by hearing a little bit about your work? So tell us what you do.
Sure. Well, my research really is focused on the relationship between emotion and inflammation, both in its ability to promote disease, but also in its power to keep us well. And so in this domain of how does this relationship promote disease, a lot of the work that I do is in people who have asthma. And asthma makes a really good model for this research for a few different reasons. It's very heavily influenced by psychological factors. So when people who have asthma experience stress, they're more likely to have an asthma attack. And during stressful times, if they are exposed to their allergen, their response to it is likely to be much more severe. And so in one aspect of my research, I'm trying to understand how this happens. How is it that something that happens in your mind can influence the function of your body in a negative way? And on the other hand, the other arm of my research is trying to understand how this relationship between emotion and inflammation can be harnessed to keep us well. And in this research, I use behavioral interventions that target the mind and its response to things like stress and emotion to buffer the effects of stress on inflammation in the body. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Enough about me. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your work?
Well, I'm a psychiatrist by training, and I was mostly a clinician, as you know, for a number of years, and got very, very interested in some Tibetan Buddhist meditation practices and whether some of these very ancient and quite striking ways that these Tibetan Buddhist adepts manipulated their bodily processes to affect their brain, whether some of those practices, if we understood them, we might better understand how we could better use our bodies to enhance emotional well-being. Mm-hmm. So I mostly study depression. So really, from that initial interest, I haven't varied that much. I've had a career looking at how the body impacts the mind and the brain, but always with an idea toward trying to understand, can we identify some of these, I call them ancient practices, things that human groups have discovered over and over again that enhance well-being. They're often used, for ritual purposes or healing purposes. Can we identify those? Can we look at whether they might be retrofitted, if you will, to help treat depression in the modern world? And whether or not we can then also understand how they work. Because if we understand how they work, that may give us a clue on how we can sort of promote the physiology of emotional well-being. So I'm interested, I'm a doc, I'm interested in physical health, but I really, it's interesting, it's sort of a paradox. So you work a lot in the mind and done a lot of work with meditation, trying to understand how the mind can influence the body, which has direct relevance for these physical disease states. I've done a lot, not exclusively, but I've done a lot of work looking at bodily processes because really I've had this long-standing interest in the nature of consciousness and what are things we can do to sort of induce and promote states of consciousness that that are good, that we enjoy, that are healthy, that help other people. So that really is at a 10,000-foot level. That's really sort of what my research has been about.
Yeah, that's such cool work, Chuck.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I really love it. I'm wondering if you can tell me a bit about why you disagree with the idea that depression is a brain disorder.
Yeah, so this is one of my things that I often talk about when I lecture. If you go to the government websites, National Institute of Health, National Institute of Mental Health, and you begin to read about depression, they say depression is a brain disorder. And, colloquially, people say that as a way to try to destigmatize it, right? There's not something wrong with you, there's something wrong with your brain. But what that perspective also often literally means is that, all we have to do is understand the brain, and we'll understand everything we need to know about depression. And I think the data overwhelmingly suggests that's not true, right? So certainly the brain, as far as we can tell, is the primary center of consciousness. If you don't have a head, you're not going to be very conscious. And if parts of your brain are taken offline, you lose consciousness. That's how anesthesia works. But just because the brain is sort of the final producer of consciousness does not mean that what causes disturbance in that consciousness, that it doesn't mean that the most important reasons for the disturbance necessarily lie in the brain, because the brain responds in 1,000 ways to inputs from other places. So, in psychiatry, what we've often done with it, you give people antidepressant. If you're living in a horribly stressful environment, if you're sick, if you're getting all these signals that are just depressogenic, just signals that make people depressed, we give you a pill, makes your brain go, well, it's all right, whatever. You can do it that way, but I've had this huge interest in whether or not you might more effectively treat something like depression by going further back into those causes that are driving the changes in the brain function. And I'll give you a classic example of this. There was a huge antidepressant study called the STAR-D study that was done now about 15 years
Yeah, I
ago.
remember that.
Remember that? Yeah, like 4,000 people. They're trying to figure out, like, what do you do when somebody fails the first antidepressant? But a brilliant and very famous researcher in our field named Myrna Weissman did a wonderful thing. She recruited a whole bunch of the women who came into that study who happened to be mothers and have kids under the age of 17. And she asked a really simple question, which is, if the mother does or does not get over her depression with the pill that she takes, does that affect the depression and the anxiety in the children? And she found something really remarkable, which is, if the mother takes the antidepressant and she gets well, her children get even better than she does. If she takes the antidepressant and it doesn't work, the children, in fact, actually do a little bit worse. So now if you think about this, right, the mom is taking the physical pill, and none of us would think that there's some magic molecules floating over to the kids. The mom takes the pill, her change sends a signal to the kids, which then changes their brains, right? So, it's not that we're blaming the mom here. We all impact each other very powerfully, but it just points to the fact that those kids had a powerful antidepressant response. And you say, well, yeah, obviously their brains changed. But the really interesting thing here was I didn't do anything directly to their brain. I just went directly to the brains of somebody else, right? And so you can see this all about, all sorts of physical things promote depression. And so the idea that we should think about depression as being limited to the brain, not only do I think it not line up with the data we have, I think it foreshortens possible treatment options. Because, if you're always just thinking, well, I got to just hit the brain directly, and we'll maybe talk about this when we talk about some of the research, you miss these opportunities to intervene further upstream, maybe to hit sensory pathways, maybe to hit the immune system, maybe to hit how people parent their children.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's really that's sort of really it, So let me ask you, Melissa, can you talk a bit about the evidence that the mind really impacts the body? So I just said, these are not brain disorders, that they're brain, mind, body, social disorders. But talk a little bit about the fact that the mind obviously does.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the most obvious sources of evidence that the mind impacts the body is the placebo effect. And actually, when you were just talking about, if a mother does well, then her children do better. Well, one potential mechanism for that is that the mother, took something and it made her do better. The expectations of the children for their own health and well-being have a lot to do actually with what actually manifests in terms of their health and well-being, and that's how the placebo effect works. And it's a very powerful illustration of the power of the mind over the body. So in biomedicine, the placebo effect is actually considered like a failed trial.
Yeah.
But really what's happening is that an expectation that one has that because they've taken some pill or they've done something that they believe is going to have an impact on their body actually brings about that impact on their body. And if that isn't a powerful demonstration of this relationship between mind and body, I don't know what is. And one of my very favorite lines of research in this regard comes out of a group from Stanford. And an example of some of the work that they've done is that they studied employees that are the cleaning staff in a hospital chain. Yeah. And in half of the individuals that they studied, they told them that their work is very good exercise. And in the other half, they didn't share that information with them. And the people that they told that their work was really good exercise showed clinically significant and very relevant decreases in risk factors for cardiovascular disease. This happened only by telling them that their work was good exercise. Compared to a group of people who that information wasn't shared with. And there are a number of examples like this that with the only manipulation that happened was your belief or your expectation about what was going to happen in your body, bringing about that reality.
And there are studies, aren't there, showing that different placebos applied to different disease states produce different effects in the brain, right? So that if you take a placebo for pain, you tend to see changes in the brain's pain kind of opioid systems. If you take placebos for Parkinson's, you see changes in the basal ganglia. Somehow, this is one of the great. I always say, if I was young and I wanted to study mental health, I would study placebo, because if you understand placebo, you understand something huge that we're often missing in medicine, frankly, which is that information, whatever the mind, things that it's not just molecules or something about the information content that when people, it changes the physical world, right? I mean, it's just fascinating.
Yeah, and that the brain ultimately, when it comes down to it, is an organ of making predictions about what the future moments and the future months, years, days are going to hold for us, and to best prepare us for that scenario. And I think the placebo is just an example of that. It's the brain's attempt to prepare us for what's coming next. And if we believe that something happened, then our brain and body participates in that reality that we've just created for ourselves, which is pretty cool.
It's a profound mystery, though, isn't it? Really, you think about there's something immaterial like the mind. I mean, whatever that is, that I can say something to you, and it's not the air molecules. It's something about what it means that can totally change how your brain and body are functioning. I mean, it's a fascinating thing where we see this. You see this, in some of the work we do with some of these novel treatments for depression, where the experience people have changes their long-term sort of depressive state. And it's sort of the same idea that they have this sort of mind state that then has these profound long-term effects on the body. It's really interesting. Yeah. Okay, let's shift topic. Let's shift over. We said we were going to talk a little bit about myths and maybe dispelling some myths, right? So, I know when you speak about your work, you often encounter some misunderstandings about the mind-body connection. There's some pernicious. So there's something very liberating about knowing that the brain and the mind and body are connected. That's why people are listening, they're interested. It gives you a sense that you might have some influence, some agency over your health and over your well-being. Right. But there could be a shadow side to that too, I think. And so I think, why don't you talk about that a little bit? What's a myth you'd like to dispel in this?
And I think you hit right on it, really. And often when I give talks about my work, one of the things that invariably comes up, both when I give talks to a non-scientific audience, but also even when I'm talking to other scientists, the work that I share can be interpreted as I've somehow caused my disease by events that happen in my mind, or if I'm failing to get better, that it's somehow my fault, that I wasn't sufficiently motivated, or I didn't try hard enough to, change my mindset, that, I'm just failing to, take care of my mind in some way. And that's not at all the message that I want to send. I think that we can think of the mind as another tool, just like you said about there are so many inputs that our brains are getting in terms of depression. in disease states in the body, there are also many factors that contribute to developing a disease and having a disease progress. And what my work suggests is that the mind is one facet of that. It can actually cause cell death in the same way that a pathogen can, but that doesn't mean that you are responsible for that. I think that the mind can really be used to support treatment in disease, and it can be helpful in that regard. But it shouldn't be taken to mean that a failure to improve is somehow an evidence of failure to use that line, just as you would never blame the doctor if a drug that they gave you was not effective in helping you. You shouldn't blame yourself if the efforts that you put toward, improving your own physical state are ineffective.
And don't you find sometimes, so there have been movements in the last 20, 30 years, these ideas that if you set an intention, that it's going to happen, right? So there's a whole thing like Secret where people, think that the universe, that you set an intention and then it happens. So if it doesn't happen, your fault, right? So it always amazes me that there certainly is a truth that if you have an intention to do something, it's likely going to help you, right? Because you're going to organize around it. If you're, but people always, the part of the mistake of all this is sort of black and white thinking, right? So, but then you go to this extreme that it has to be the case that, and if my intention didn't happen, then, it's my fault. Never mind the fact you're not the only person in the world. Other people have intentions. There's random accidents, right? I guess, are you saying sort of the same thing that first off, our minds are largely, much of what happens in our minds is sponsored by physical things that we don't have full control over. And just because your mind can help to some degree, even in powerful ways, it doesn't mean that your mind is responsible for everything.
Right.
And that's where people tend to go. Right?
Exactly. It's not this massive lever that can move all burdens. It's one channel through which you can influence your health. And but there are lots of other channels that are participating in that process, and this is just one of them. And this one channel can be helpful in supporting those other channels, but it's not the only one.
Right. And if the other channels are coming in strongly and loudly enough, it puts limits on what the mind can do, I think, at this point, right? I mean, if you are dying of cancer, the mind can put you in a state where you're more at peace. There's some studies that may keep you alive for a bit, maybe, but I mean, the mind is not going to be able, there are just situations where the mind has its own limits too.
It's true. It's very true. And a lot of it has to do with your relationship to what's happening in your body. And so this isn't just about, curing your illness or reducing your symptoms. It's also about your quality of life.
Yep.
And so having the best quality of life that you can have, despite what might be happening in your body, is another way to look at this. You're not piling on.
Yeah.
You're not, adding to the misery of whatever might be happening in your body.
And, and I think also it's funny, I was talking about a month ago with a colleague of mine who is kind of one of the world's leading researchers in psychedelics. And these psychedelic medicines there's sort of groundswell of interest in this potential new treatments for depression that we're much involved with. But we were talking about this, and he said this really interesting thing. He said, when these medicines, which induce these really powerful effects in people sometimes, when they work, what they seem to do is they just show people, the world's not perfect. You're not all powerful. The world's not perfect. It's always been hard. It's this is an old Buddhist truth, right? Just the way the world is set up, it's just hard. And I think that's one of the mind states that, to a certain degree, can be really useful.
Yeah.
Like Tibetan doctors I've known will often, some of their treatments for depression we'd find very unorthodox, where they tell people, well, life really is hard. Go look at other people; they're also suffering.
Right.
So I think that's part of it too. It's sort of interesting, as we think about. That's the balance to this idea. We have this idea that things should be great and getting better every day in our world, right? And I think that's sometimes the burden we carry for that is we don't allow ourselves to say, it's just because it's going to help some doesn't mean it has to be perfect.
And not to take it personally.
Yeah, and not to take it personally. So that's really so. I'll offer up a myth that I would love to bust, and it's interesting, and it's a two-part myth. It is that inflammation is always bad, and that inflammation explains everything. And they're separate, but they're sort of linked. So let me start up with the inflammation explains everything. So, I became a researcher initially because I was interested in this Tibetan Buddhist meditation practices, but because these practices, ancient practices, were so involved in bodily, especially manipulating body temperature, that over time I became a researcher in the immune system. And, this is very much like you, and this is what we share in common, is we're very interested in how does the brain affect the immune system? How does the immune system affect the brain? And we were early folks working in this realm that inflammation might cause depression. And when we first started this back in the late 90s, I mean, a lot of people looked like we were crazy because when I went to med school, the immune system was totally separate. It's over
Right.
here, and the brain's here, and the immune system's about fighting bugs, and the brain's about thinking and stuff like that. And it was the most amazing thing. I watched over a decade where we went from being like kind of weirdos in the mental health research world to being like, oh, cutting edge,
The winds of change.
to being like, oh, inflammation explains everything. And I've had to go around for the last couple of few years, often giving lectures, sort of trying to dispel the very research we did because, especially for things that are difficult. I think it was Chekhov that said if there's many, many treatments for a disorder, it means it has no cure. And if you think about things like depression and anxiety and emotional suffering, we have tons of treatments because there's not an easy cure. But we, especially in mental health psychiatry, I think one of the things where we fall down is we're always looking for the magic bullet that's going to solve all problems. And
Right.
so, inflammation has come to the fore culturally and scientifically, appropriately so, as this super important mechanism that underlies a lot of different disease states, right? But just like we were talking about, like the secret where, just because your intentions can influence things, to go to the next step and think that explains everything. People sort of done this with inflammation,
right?
And so, all you got to do is go to the local vitamin store, and you can see this idea that at all costs, what you want to do is reduce inflammation. And so this is really interesting, and it ties into this many, many studies now. What many people think is that something like depression is an inflammatory disorder, right? Because there's a lot of studies showing that if you measure 100 people with depression and 100 people that aren't, on average, the depressed people have slightly higher inflammation. But we and others have done studies that are really, it just shows you the dangers of just making these sort of gross overgeneralizations. We did a study a number of years ago where we actually took people that were healthy but depressed and gave them a very, very powerful medicine that does nothing but block inflammation. And we were convinced that it was going to work as a beautiful antidepressant because we thought depression was an inflammatory condition. And the results were quite striking. First off, placebo worked better. Not significantly, but numerically better. So you were better getting, this was an infusion we put in people's veins. You were better if you were depressed, on average, getting 3 infusions of salt water than you were of getting 3 infusions of this very powerful drug called Infliximab. But the really striking thing was we found that if you were depressed and your inflammation was up,
Yeah, that's what I
right?
was just going to ask.
Yep.
Yep.
If you're depressed and your inflammation's up, you block the inflammation with this powerful drug, and yeah, you do better than placebo, right?
So it's like a subgroup.
Yes, it's like a subgroup. There's some people wandering around who have elevated inflammation, and is probably contributing to them being depressed. This goes back to my thing about depression not being just a brain disorder, right? Because interestingly, this medicine we gave, Infliximab, it doesn't get into the brain. So we gave people that were depressed a drug that stays in the body. If your inflammation is up, that inflammation in your body is signaling the brain to make it depressed. You turn off the signal, the brain gets undepressed. Right. But the people that were just as depressed and had low levels of inflammation did so much better with placebo than by blocking the inflammation, that the only interpretation could be that for a whole bunch of depressed people, trying to lower their inflammation, if it's not high, you're going to make them worse. You're doing them a disservice.
Right.
And other people have found the same thing with things like omega-3 fatty acids.
Yeah, so there are many roads that lead to Rome.
There's many roads that lead to Rome, and so whenever we hear something like inflammation, first off, it's not an answer to everything, and second off, it's not always bad.
Yeah.
We need a little bit of inflammation.
Right, exactly. Right? It's an important part of immune system function.
In fact,
first of all,
a long time
we would
ago,
all die of bacterial infections.
Absolutely. And there have been some studies showing that in some depressed people, you give them a little inflammation, they actually do better. Yeah. So it's pretty interesting.
Well, I don't want to cut you off, Chuck, but I know that our audience is interested in learning more about how they might apply this information in their own lives. And I don't know about you, but I'm a big proponent of taking care of our mental health in the same way that we would take care of our physical health. And there are many ways to do this. One strategy is meditation, which we have studied extensively in our group and do have evidence that it's helpful. If you're interested in getting started, you can check out tryhealthyminds.org, and there's a free app that you can download. If you're interested in that route. However, meditation is only one strategy that can be used.
And it's not for everybody,
It's
right?
not right for everybody. And there are other strategies that there's also really good evidence have benefits for both mental and physical health, such as physical exercise. That there's very clear evidence of the effects not only on the body but also on the mind. Also, spending time in nature. Doing things
there's this
that
thing
are
called forest bathing now, right? There've been a number of studies from Japan showing that it has pretty nice
and even
antidepressant
just
effects.
living in a greener space actually has been shown to be associated with better mental health. Spending time doing activities that are meaningful to you and that you feel like you have a purpose. That's another big one. Building strong social connections. I think, if I were to promote one, that would really be it. We know how important that is. So there's strategies out there for everyone. So I just encourage you to take care of your mind in the same way that you would take care of your body and find whatever strategy is right for you.
Right. And just to add conversely, the opposite or the obverse is true also, that really taking care of your body and taking care of your health is one of the best ways you can take care of your mind.
For sure.
I mean, that is one of the most powerful ways that the mind-body connection, this bi-directional thing, right?
Right.
How we really see that.
Yeah, when one is functioning well, the other one is more likely to function well too.
World Health Organization, probably 10 years ago now, did a huge study all around the world and found that, in fact, medical illness was the #1 risk factor for depression everywhere in all cultures.
Interesting.
Right? And of course, it's a horrible stressor being sick, but we were talking about inflammation, and there's no doubt that on average, if your inflammation goes up, it's a risk factor for getting depressed. And of course, sickness is driven by inflammation.
As is stress.
As is stress, right, exactly. So it turns out that physical stress, that emotional stressors activate the immune system in ways that are very similar to what you see if you get sick, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Which is probably why the symptoms of depression and the symptoms of sickness overlap.
Exactly.
In so many ways, which is really interesting. Okay, well, let's address some of the questions that our audience members, shall we?
Let's do it.
Over the last week. Okay, so this one's for you, Melissa. Have you, maybe not you, just you personally, right? But you're a neuroimager, you're a brain researcher. Has the field identified an area or areas of the brain which act as like a hub or a center for the mind-body connection?
Yeah, that's a good question. First, I think it's important to think about the brain not as a collection of pieces, but as really a series of networks or circuits that are differentially engaged depending on the context that one is in. And so while I wouldn't say that there's an area of the brain that acts as a hub, there's no person in there like turning the wheels or steering the car.
The little guy.
But there are networks that are known to be important in bringing about this mind-body connection. And one of those networks that's really important is a network called the salience network. And it's just a fancy word, really, or a fancy phrase for a collection of brain regions that help to prioritize information that's coming into the brain from the environment, from the body. And that network is the areas of the brain that contribute to it. There's a bunch, but the prominent ones are the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the amygdala. Yeah. And the insula in particular is thought to be important in determining the salience of what's called interoceptive information, or information that's coming up from the body to the brain, really helping the brain to know what is happening in the body. If there's an infection, if there's a wound or something like that. And we know from our own research that the greater this network is active, the greater it's going to respond to those signals that are coming up from the body. So one example of this is in a study that we did with people who have asthma. And what we were able to show is that the more this network was responsive to information about asthma, like words that are associated with the disease, like suffocate, wheeze, the greater the inflammatory response when that person was exposed to an allergen.
So you mean, so if I remember your study, you put people in a scanner,
Right.
you showed them these words like suffocate,
Right.
and if this insular area and the connection with the amygdala, if that network, to the degree that that fired up, to that degree, if you dropped an allergen or an asthma, inducing thing into a person's lung, they had more of a response.
Exactly.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
Yeah. And so it seems to be this, in a sense, sort of like a vigilance for like, what's coming. And the more vigilance you have, the greater the response. It's sort of what I was saying before about the brain's role as anticipating the environment that we're going to be in. If you're anticipating, this negative thing that's about to come, when you experience it, your response to it is going to be bigger. That's sort of how I interpret it.
It primes it. And of course, from an
Exactly.
evolutionary point of view, that can be quite beneficial.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, this is one of the arguments for why stress activates inflammation, because across most of evolution, stress usually meant you're about to get bitten, eaten, clubbed, and so you're going to open up your skin, you're going to increase your risk for infection. So you see stress, the brain says, well, it's better
need
to
to protect
fire up
myself.
I'm going to fire up the inflammation now,
right, exactly.
just in case I need it.
Right. Unfortunately, we're not encountering, animals that are trying to kill us very much these days, and so
we pay the price and don't get the benefit.
Exactly, we're paying the price, right?
Yeah.
I think maybe we should move on to the next question.
Sure. So let's see. The next question. Has any research linked diet to a healthy mind as yet? And if so, what guidance can you give us about the foods to eat, please? So I can start with this one. We can both weigh in. But yes, the answer is definitely. So, I mean, we don't need to hear say today that what you eat has a huge influence on your physical health. That's so obvious, it goes without saying. But there have been a number of studies in the last few years looking at whether what you eat predicts how depressed you're going to be, how emotionally unhappy, and they're actually very consistent, and they're quite interesting. A number of them have come from Australia, and the bottom line in these studies is, if you eat really junky bad food now, no matter how depressed you are now, you're going to be more depressed later. Right, so that you can control for how depressed people are. You're depressed, you eat junky food, but so it really looks like what you eat now is certainly going to influence how you feel now, but it's also going to influence, if it's a pattern of life for you, it's going to influence whether you're more or less depressed in the future. Now, what's interesting is the several studies that have looked at this suggest that the bar for dodging this bullet, if you will, is not that you have to be a vegan, or not that you have to be super persnickety or scrupulous about what you eat. Where you really see the effect is junk food, right? So most of the effect, if you eat a normal, balanced, healthy diet, that seems to get you into the camp where you're protected. If you're going to McDonald's every day, if you're eating a lot of high-fat food and a lot of that stuff, that's the thing. So it's almost like a poison thing, right? A lot of modern food, it kind of has a poison element to it. And so if you are indulging in that now, not only are you likely to feel worse now, but that does seem to be a risk factor for depression. On the contrary side, there is now evidence, however, that there's something called the MIND diet, which is I can't go into the details here, but it's kind of a Mediterranean diet. It's high on omega-3 fatty acids. It's high on fruits and vegetables, and sort of non-processed meat and healthy carbs. But that diet has been actually shown to be protective now against cognitive decline in folks at risk for Alzheimer's. And there's some evidence that it also has antidepressant effects. So I do think now we can say that you are what you eat in terms of your emotional functioning. And so this is really, I struggle with this personally. I have bad dietary habits, and it's frustrating because we talk about like not blaming yourself for stuff, but I can see to do this. I have a bit of an addiction for bad food, so it's personally meaningful to me, but the data are quite striking. The other thing I'm interested in, and if I had 1,000 years and $1 trillion that I would personally study, it's being studied, is this emerging evidence that certain types of fasting can actually have antidepressant effects and have mood elevating effects.
Oh.
Well, if there are like 1,000 different diets to lose weight in the modern world, but the one incontrovertible thing about our lives is we just eat too much. Humans did not evolve
Right.
to eat as much as we do. And there's data showing that going without food for a while activates dopamine circuitry in the basal ganglia, the sort of hedonic centers and search centers, right? But it makes sense, right? You're going to want to be up and interested in going if you need to go look for your next meal.
Right, and the food's going to taste a lot
And
better.
the food's going to taste a lot better,
Even if
and
it's low
you get more
quality.
benefit from exercising if you do that. So trying to find ways, it's not very sexy because it's pretty simple, but you know, a huge thing we can do in relationship to diet and mental health is just not eat as much. And so I think that and in fact, I talked in the beginning of this about how I have this sort of interest in ancient practices,
Right.
and how a lot of ancient practices, that were discovered repeatedly around the world, were often put to spiritual or religious use. As fasting is a classic example. It's part of almost every major religion. Yeah, well, why would stopping eating have to do with getting closer to God? And I think, like some other things, the answer is because it induces mental states that tend to be more positive, more upbeat. So yeah, I think there's a huge relationship between diet and mental health.
I'm wondering if you want to talk at all about another facet of this, which is the role of the microbiome in the gut in mental health. So there was just a
Yeah, go
science
ahead.
paper recently showing that the composition of the gut microbiome um, could influence the responsivity of the amygdala, which is an important brain region. It's
Say a
part of
little more.
what
Can you say a little more about that? Can you just give what they found? Because that's really interesting to
I
people.
actually don't remember the details.
Okay.
I read it a while ago, but just the fact that, microbes in our gut have a role in influencing our brain function, I think is a pretty profound.
And the connection with diet, of course, is that what you eat is a
Exactly.
powerful
You have to
driver
feed
of
your
your microbiome.
microbiome, right?
Yes,
So,
that's
like, if
right.
you're eating a lot of processed foods, that is the exact wrong thing that is going to promote healthy growth of the microbiome. The microbiome really need a lot of fiber. I mean, that's what they survive on.
Yep.
And so, if you're eating a diet that is full of natural fiber, that's a good way to promote a healthy microbiome. And the idea that this is important in regulating your brain activity, I think, is a relatively new idea that we'll learn more about, I think, in the coming years, because this is a really hot area of research right now. But I think it really is just another very emblematic example of how intimate the environment, the brain and the body
Yep.
are with each other. They're really not separate.
And of course, the microbiome is fascinating because, 90% of the cells in our body are not ours. They're
Exactly.
bacterial and fungal but what's interesting is that they're in us, but they are not us. They have their own genetic destiny. We are communities. I mean, this is, the microbiome really says that the mind we have and the thoughts we have, they're partly our biology and they're partly somebody else's biology. We are a committee already in a way, right? And so finding you talked about the importance of social relationships, and one of the things I've been fascinated with is this idea that some of the rules governing human social relationships pertain in our relationships with the microbiome and with bacteria in general, right? So if you're violent with other people, they tend to come back and be violent with you. And one of the things we've learned about antibiotics is life-saving when used judiciously, but they're massively violent towards the bacterial world.
Right.
And now coming back, right? And they're, antibiotics are bad news for the microbiome, and there are now studies showing that the more a kid is exposed to an antibiotic, the greater their risk of subsequent depression,
Yeah, and
ADHD.
yeah, and there've been studies showing that the use of an antibiotic influences brain function for years.
Yeah, which is just amazing. So so it's so amazing that we are such interconnected beings. That I mean, exactly. That this even goes beyond the body's effect on the brain. This is more in a way like the mom's effect on the child's brain. In that these bugs, they're pursuing their own thing. They have their own agendas.
Right.
They're sending signals to the brain not because they want to make us happy or unhappy, but because they evolved to manipulate us in
Yeah.
certain ways, And there's some fascinating papers on what's called pathogen manipulation, where bugs can change. There's, for instance, the flu vaccine makes people more social,
Right.
which is
Yeah.
really cool, right? Because the vaccine is, because the bug, the flu virus, wants us to be social because it wants to spread, right? We think being social is good, so does the flu virus, right? So I mean,
Yeah.
these ecological,
I know.
holistic ways of looking at
There's
things
some
are
really cool
so
examples
cool,
of that
right?
too. I'm wondering if you want to talk about your research with dogs.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So a couple of years ago, and we're just now writing up the results, we did a study where we took older adults, and I hate to say older means 55 and older, so I could have gotten a dog, but we took people that hadn't had dogs for a long time, and we gave them a dog. Because there are these fascinating studies showing that children raised with dogs are less likely to get asthma and allergies, and
Because of
families
their
with,
microbiome.
yeah, because of
Yeah.
the microbiome, and the families share as much of their microbiome with the dog as they do with each other. So the dog becomes like a delivery method for potentially positive microbiome. It's like a probiotic,
Yeah.
right? Dogs is probiotics. So we gave older folks the dogs, and we followed them for 3 months, and it was interesting. We did not find that the dog changed the adult's microbiome, but giving the adults a dog markedly reduced their inflammation, which was really cool, and made them less depressed, more happy, more physically functional. But amazing that a dog could reduce inflammation. Of course, the reason the dog, in this case, I'm sure, is because the brain. Right. So in this case,
Exactly.
the
So
dog
now
wasn't operating through the microbiome, it was
we're talking
operating
about
through.
brain
So there
body.
we are back up to
Yeah.
mind or brain to body. So it really cool. So just a final question before we wrap up for you, Melissa. Is there any evidence to support the idea that meditation can be used to target and heal physical illnesses?
Well, there's a lot of evidence. I only have about a minute to talk about this because we sort of rambled on for a while, but we have evidence from our own work showing, I've done work where we actually created an inflammatory response in the skin of healthy volunteers and showed that training and meditation could reduce the effect of we created that inflammatory response using a cream put on the skin, and training in mindfulness could reduce the effect of that cream, the inflammatory effect, compared to a group that were trained in other aspects of well-being, but not in a mindfulness specific way.
Specifically, yeah.
And so that was in healthy volunteers, but we have recently finished a study looking at whether mindfulness training could buffer the effects of stress in people who have asthma.
Yeah.
And we haven't published that data yet, but basically what we found is that following mindfulness training, people who have asthma had much better asthma control, meaning they had to use their medication less, they were woken up fewer times by their asthma symptoms. Their activities were interfered with less because of their asthma symptoms, and actually objective measures of their airway inflammation went down.
When you stimulated them with a
No, this was
allergen?
not
No, not
stimulated.
stimulated.
This was just in their daily lives. So these are just the symptoms that they're experiencing and the airway inflammation that they have just as part of their normal daily life.
And this was a straight ahead mindfulness. How long was the mindfulness
8
intervention?
weeks.
Was it was mindfulness based stress reduction?
It
Is that what you
was,
did?
yep.
Yep. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and there are many examples of this. So the work that I've done is in asthma, but many other people have done work looking at recovery from cancer treatment and cardiovascular disease. Chronic pain
Yep.
is a really common application of mindfulness training, and so there are lots of examples of where these types of interventions and really the brain-body connection can be harnessed to promote wellness. But I would never recommend that somebody would do that to the exclusion.
Back to what we were saying.
Exactly.
Back to the myth busting thing. Right?
There are
Yep.
many ways to get to Rome, and you don't want to rely only on one.
Exactly.
Right? You want to harness all of those.
Do your
factors.
meditation, but keep your inhaler with you.
Exactly.
Right, basically. Right,
Exactly.
but how cool if you can meditate and use your inhaler less.
Maybe you'll need it less. Exactly.
Exactly. That's the way to think about it.
Exactly.
Right? These things should be used in synergy. That's really what integrative medicine is, right? It's
Right.
it's the idea that these sort of behavioral approaches, things like meditation, they don't replace medicine. They interact in complex
complement
ways.
them.
But they complement them.
Exactly.
It's really
Yeah.
complementary. Okay, well, you know what? That's all the time we have for today. We managed to blow through 45 minutes, as I knew we would. Yeah, if you've enjoyed this, and I hope you have, look for additional resources on the Center for Healthy Minds website. We'll be sending out this recording out to our email list. If you aren't on the list, please visit. It is centerhealthyminds.org. So the Center Healthy Minds business is all run together. To subscribe for well-being tips and research updates. And please, we hope you'll share this video link with your networks.
Yeah, and this was really fun. Thanks for having this conversation today,
great.
Chuck. And thank all of you for joining us from around the world today and for sending us questions. We look forward to stay connected with you. Thank you.
Be well.